Hey everyone, Next.js 16 is here and I'm here to walk you through it. So there are some really big updates in this new version, both at the Next.js level as well as the React level, which we'll take a look at. But overall, I think it's a major improvement, so definitely watch the whole video so you can get a good sense of what has changed. So they have a blog post here outlining some of the changes, but let me actually just show you here in the IDE some of the things that have actually changed. So let's actually just jump into it. I want to start a brand new Next.js application, so we can still use npx create next app. By the time you're watching this, you may already use latest for version 16. However, as of recording, it's still in beta, so I have to use beta here and I want everything in the current directory. So now we get a new setup here. So they have a recommended default. Instead of clicking through 5 options or so, you have just one option that you can pick here and it will go with some default settings here. And they're using a template here. And now it's finished and let's take a look. So there is no source folder. We just have the app folder here, but everything else should look familiar here. So let's actually start our Next.js application. We can still run npm run dev. And let's open this up. All right, so here is the new homepage. Looks like this is also a new template here on the homepage. So I removed a bunch of the boilerplate and I made it more like a real application. So let's actually take a look at the other things that have changed here. So I have removed the default boilerplate and I've made it more like a list of posts here and you can submit one. We'll talk more about this in a second. But if I go to the homepage, I refresh here. If we actually take a look at the logging, we can see that this has also changed. So instead of giving you one number, it now splits it up by how long it took to compile that route and how long it took to render. And if you have middleware, or what is now called Proxy, we'll talk about it in a second, it also shows you that. So now it's better split up, so you can better attribute why certain things take a longer time. Because previously some people were complaining that Next.js was slow. In some of those cases, it was actually because the rendering of their page just took a bit longer. So now it's easier to attribute where the time is spent on getting it ready for the user. All right, and this is being bundled by default now with Turbopack. So Turbopack has become the default now for development, but also here for your production build. So if I run a build here, it should feel faster for you. And you will now also see the time it took for each of these steps here. So you have more visibility into that as well. So about Turbopack, this is basically a bundler for your Next.js apps. Previously, it was Webpack. So a bundler allows us essentially to, well, split up our code in different files. Right, so I'm importing things from other files here or modules. And so that is all combined at some point by the bundler, right? So I can export things from other files and I can import them into this file. And the bundler also does code splitting. So it splits it by route in Next. So on the home page, it will load the code for that page. So we're not unnecessarily loading code of pages that we're never going to visit. And it also, if you're importing only one function from a file, it's not going to include all the other code from that file in the final output either. So it also does some tree shaking. And in Next.js, we have use client, right? So part of the code needs to go to the browser and part of the code should remain on the server. So that distinction is also made by the bundler. And if you run a build, it will also make sure that your files get minified and basically optimize everything and so on. And overall, yeah, with Turbopack, it should be much faster. So there's been a lot of tweets how much faster everything is now. A lot of people have reported pretty significant performance benefits. So if you're upgrading to Next.js 16, then when you run a build, in many cases, it will be significantly faster. So some people have reported 50% faster. Here's a person who went from 2 minutes and 15 seconds to 30 seconds. So some really massive performance benefits here. That will put the build output here in .next. And there is actually also a new folder here called dev. And this is actually meant for coding agents. So if you've been using these coding agents, or I have GitHub Copilot, I also have Codex here, maybe using Claude Code. Basically, these coding agents are pretty eager to run a build. Basically, they're doing a bunch of code changes and then they kind of want to verify that what they did didn't break anything. So they like to run a build because during the build, there's also types are checked, there's some linting. So basically, it's an easy way for them to verify that they didn't break anything in the app. However, if you're already running a development server and then your coding agent is running a build, that could cause a conflict. And maybe you've experienced that. So now they added a dev folder here, and that should help with that problem. So there should be fewer conflicts now between your coding agents and your development server. All right, now what if you have an app and you want to add some middleware to it? Well, actually that has changed now. So now it's not called middleware anymore. It has been renamed to Proxy. So you have to create a file called proxy.ts, and then you also have to export a function called proxy. So previously this was called middleware, but it has been renamed to Proxy. It works the same, but the renaming is mostly, I think, to signal to the developer that this is not exactly the same as middleware that you're maybe used to from other frameworks like Express or other frameworks. So it's typically not recommended to do things here like make database calls, for example, where you have to go over the network, basically IO operations, or doing long tasks here, or complex compute intensive things here, right? So this is not meant for that. The idea here is to use this for lightweight, quick redirects, for example, or rewrites. So what are some examples of things that you could do in here? So maybe there's an incoming request for your /about, but you want to add some locale indicated to the URLs, so you can rewrite the URL before you continue. Or maybe you're doing some kind of A/B testing, so you need to rewrite the URL for that. Or maybe you have some kind of multi-tenancy setup where using the app on a different subdomain, but then for API calls, the request needs to use a different URL depending on the tenant. Maybe bot detection, for example. As long as it's lightweight and fast, you can try adding it here to Proxy. Now, what about authentication? This is a bit of a gray area. So if you're doing authentication with database sessions where you have to make a call to your database to understand if the user should have access or not, well, that is probably not recommended to add here, right? So we don't want to go make network calls from this place here. But what if you have a JSON Web Token strategy where basically all the info is in the JSON Web Token? In that case, we do not need to go out to our database. All the information is going to be available to us here. Can you then do the authentication in middleware or Proxy? Well, I would say it's still not recommended. For example, maybe you have a component in your app that is fetching data, and only logged in users should be able to view that data. Well, if you're using that component suddenly on some other page and you forget to update the matcher here, non-logged in users could view the data. Right, so this will only run for the home page right now. So if you're retrieving data from your database on some other page, this is not going to run. So if you have the authentication check, if you're doing that in here, it's not going to run when you actually want it to. If you do the authentication check in here, you always have to keep in mind that the matcher here matches up with where you're actually accessing data in your app. And I would say it's pretty common that you actually forget. So if you accidentally fetch data in some other component and that component is then used on some other page, well, you may forget to update the matcher. And especially if you work in a team of people, some people may just use that component somewhere else on a different page, and suddenly this is out of sync. So doing the authentication check, the middleware or Proxy here is probably not recommended for any strategy actually. But then where should you do authentication? Well, I have some other videos on this on what's called a data access layer. So you want to have one dedicated place in your app where you access all the data in your database, and you want to couple the authentication check or authorization checks with the data fetching, so that right before you actually access data, you have that check to see if the user is authorized to access it, and then only use functions from this data access layer. So wherever you use this function in your app, on any page, in any component, there is always an authentication check coming with it. Right? This is a better architecture in my view. So I would say authentication in Proxy, probably not. There are some exceptions. So if you have a magazine or like a blog type of website and you want to keep the pages statically rendered, as it's called, using a data access layer will probably make them dynamically rendered. So in that case, the only solution that I have seen so far personally is to actually do the authentication in Proxy. This can keep your pages statically rendered. It's a bit of a complex topic, so I'll have a separate video on this soon. So if you want to preserve static rendering of pages that are behind a login, so for example, an article only for paying members, then in that case, I don't know any other way actually to keep it statically rendered. So that could be an exception. Or you want to have optimistic redirecting. So there's an incoming request for a secret page and only logged in users should be able to access it. Well, I have my main authentication check in my data access layer, but maybe for some reason I do want to have a very fast response to that. So I can already have like an optimistic redirect here to quickly check if the user even has a token, for example, and if not, we can immediately redirect them here already from here before we do anything else in the app. So that may be an exception as well. But I would say the rule is not to do authentication. It's a bit of a complex topic and I'll have a separate video on this soon. There are also some improvements with prefetching. So they mentioned layout deduplication as well as incremental prefetching. So just to show you what prefetching is in Next.js, if I add a link here to the page, this link component, I'm linking to /about here, I'm putting that all the way at the end. Then if I scroll there and it gets into the viewport, nothing happens here during development. But if I run a build, npm run build, and now I want to run that build, I have to run npm run start. So now I'm running the build here. If I now scroll all the way down and slowly but surely get it into the viewport, you can see as soon as it gets into the viewport, it actually makes a fetch call to get that page, or I should say React server component, right? A page is actually just a React component. It's a server component, and you can see that has been fetched now. So prefetching is enabled by default in production, but you're not gonna see it in development. So you actually have to run a build and then use npm run start to actually see the prefetching. Now imagine this was a footer with 100 links, right? So you have some websites that have a lot of links in the footer. So you do wanna be a little bit careful with the prefetching behavior. You can actually set it to false if you want, so there's ways to configure it, but they have made some other improvements here. So layout duplication, so you can have a layout file here, right? So you can have nested layout. So if you have a particular layout for the footer and you have those 100 links, they share the same layout, then they may all have fetched that layout as well. So that is deduplicated now. So they now also cancel requests when the link leaves the viewport, and they prioritize link prefetching on hover. So when you're actually going over it with your mouse, or when it's re-entered into the viewport. It will also prefetch them again if their data is invalidated. And we're going to have something called cache components. I'll talk about it in a second. So basically a bunch of improvements here for prefetching, and it may cause more individual prefetch requests, but the total transfer sizes should typically be lower. And they think that's the right trade-off for nearly all applications, and it requires no code modifications and should improve the performance of your apps. And then there are also some caching changes. Now I know when I start talking about caching in Next.js, some of you are getting scared, but actually I think it's going to simplify a lot very soon. So there are actually some changes here, and I think it's good to understand them a little bit. So if you have some kind of page here, right, the home page, what am I doing here? I just have a list of posts. I currently only have one post in my database. So I'm getting all of these posts from my database here, and I'm just displaying them here in a list, right? So in the URL here, I'm just mapping over them. Right, very basic data fetching here in Next.js, right from my database, server component, so I can do it all here. And I then also have a form, so a user can create a new post. So here I have a form, and if I say test and write test, I should be able to hit publish. And when I do that, you can see it's actually submitted. And I also almost immediately see it appear here in the UI without refreshing. So how does that work? Well, this is done with a server action, right? So here I have action is create post. So this is using a server action here. So the data of that form is actually sent to my Next.js server side right here. And we can grab the title and the content, and then we can simply add it to our database. Okay, so then the post is part of my database, but that doesn't mean that the actual UI changes, right? So if we want that, we can actually use revalidate path. This is actually a really powerful API because when the data goes from the browser here to our server side, right, that's the request. And then as part of the response, we can immediately send the updated UI with the new blog post, right? So if I show you that, if I say test 2, and I say test 2, if I publish this, you can see there is a request from the browser to the server side. So with these server actions, it's actually just a post on the route that you're using them. So it's on the home page here. And you can see in the payload that it sends along the data from the form as part of that request, right? And then here in the response, this looks like gibberish, but it's actually just a description of what the new UI should be. In the same request response cycle, we have also updated the UI. Now, by the way, what else was I doing here? Well, very commonly, we want to do a bunch of additional work on our data. So in this case, when the user submits a new post, I want to, for example, do some SEO enrichment on that post. Get a proper SEO title and SEO description automatically for that post. I perhaps want to create translations of that post so I can serve a different version for different locales. I may want to check for spam or other sensitive details in the post. and maybe I want to index it for search, right? Maybe I want to create some embeddings so that people can efficiently search for that post. So basically, I want to do a bunch of additional work on that post. And this is very common in the real world. If you're building anything that's a little bit more sophisticated than just a pure demo app, you will see that you often need to do a lot of that additional work. And this is a bit tricky to do in Next.js. Next.js is really built around a very fast request response cycle, right? So we get some incoming request and we quickly return something to the user. So I've actually really enjoyed using Motion for this. They're sponsoring the channel, but they make it super easy to do, for example, a bunch of background jobs. So I'm just making an API call to trigger that workflow. And when Motion is finished, it can take multiple minutes, but it will call back into my app to let me know it finished. At that point, I can update the post in the database with the additional data that I need about it. In the meantime, I can already quickly give a response back to the user. Right, I'll show you more about this later. It's actually super interesting. I know a lot of you want to do background jobs, and it's really tricky to do in Next.js, but I'll show you more about this in a second. I just quickly wanted to give you an example of some other realistic things that we would typically want to do here. But let me just quickly explain how this caching works now. Great. So this is really powerful, but there is a bit of a downside here, or a couple. So we are now invalidating the cache for the whole page. Right, so we may actually have other things on the page that really aren't affected by a new post. So we're busting the cache for the whole page. And also, we may actually have these posts on another page as well. You can imagine we could have a dashboard page where we show the most recent posts, the 5 most recent posts, let's say. That may also be cached. And so we would want to bust that cache as well. So what's going to happen, I think, there are some new things in Next.js with caching. It's going to look a little bit differently. So we're going to have a function, for example, that we can call getPost, right? So we can just do this, right? This is how I would fetch data, but we're going to have a new directive that you're going to see more often, and it's going to be the useCache directive. We're telling Next.js the result of this function should be cached. Wherever we fetch data on the home page or a dashboard page, the result of this is cached. And we can give it a tag so that we can also invalidate and I have to import like that. It's still unstable as a recording, but I can sort of mark this cache with a name, an identifier, just called posts. That makes sense. So then wherever I use get posts, whether it's on the home page or the dashboard page or anywhere else where I want to show a list of posts, it will be cached. But then later, for example, because there's a new post, I can use that tag name to invalidate the cache. So in that case, I don't only want to revalidate the home page, right? That's just one page, but we may actually fetch the data on other pages. So wherever that function is used, I want to invalidate it or revalidate it. So there is the function revalidate tag. So we have a little bit more fine-grained control over that data and its caching behavior. So we already had revalidate tag, but there's one change here, which is now there's a second parameter here, and I need to specify some kind of cache life. So basically some information about how it should be cached. They do recommend max for most cases from what I've been reading. Now I'm purging that cache of the posts wherever I'm getting the post, right? So I think you're going to see this a lot. You're going to mark something as cached. You're going to give it some kind of tag, which allows you to get fine-grained control over when it should be invalidated. And then you can use revalidate tag. Now this gives you what they call still while revalidate behavior. So what that means is there's a new post in the database and we're going to purge the cache for the post. So the next time that somebody is going to view the post, initially it will actually still serve the old posts. So the outdated posts, you could say, because that's faster. So the first time somebody goes there, it's going to be old posts. And then in the background, it's going to get the latest ones. This is as fast as possible. But we now also have a new function called update tag. So this is new and we can only use it in server actions. And what we can do here is we can get a different pattern here, a different behavior, what's called read your write. So now when we add a new post to our database, update tag, in this case, the next time somebody views posts on our page, we're not gonna show them outdated data. We're just going to get the latest ones actually from so we're not gonna serve anything from a cache. We're actually going to reach out to our database in this case and get the data. That means it may take a bit longer, right? Because here, initially it will just serve the old data from the cache. So that is faster. And then in the background, it will get the latest ones. So then later at some point, it will still be fresh data, but initially it will be outdated data. So this is just faster, but outdated data. Here, this is slower because the user will actually have to wait until we've made the data fetch from our data source. So this is slower, but more accurate. This is faster, not as accurate. So if you want faster behavior for your data, you want to go with revalidate tag, and you have to specify this new cache live. They have described it in the docs, the options, but typically it's going to be max. However, if accuracy is the most important thing for your app, you typically want to go with update tag, right? So I think this combination of marking it with a tag, your data fetching, then invalidating the cache either with revalidate tag or update tag is going to be very common. So now if I try submitting this test 6 here, I've been trying some other things. If I click publish now, you can see it also appears here in the UI for me, similar to what we had before revalidate path, but now we have more fine-grained control. Now, if it doesn't appear in the UI, or you have some other situation where you want to refresh the UI, there's now also refresh. And actually, this is meant for what I call dynamic data. So if you actually are fetching some data and that is not cached, but you still want to update the UI, you may want to use this refresh. This is actually meant as a server-side counterpart to what you had on the client side with the router. You can do router.refresh on the client side, but you can actually now trigger that from the server side directly after updating the data as well. And the other thing that has changed here is actually partial pre-rendering. I actually had a few videos on this and a lot of you really liked it, but that is actually changing. And just to quickly recap, basically when you run a build, as we saw here, run a build, it will actually generate static pages, right? So basically here I have a home page. It's going to try to create HTML out of this. And then we can put it on a CDN. So then when somebody goes there, or a lot of people go there, we can immediately serve the page, right? We don't have to do any computation here. The HTML is already ready to go. This is optimal. And you can see when you run a build that that's what it's doing. It will even show you for each route here, whether it's static, right? So it has been pre-rendered and ready to go, or dynamic. But typically we want to keep it statically rendered because that is the fastest possible experience for the user. But that is not possible if you have, for example, a header in here and you're doing some kind of, for example, it's something with authentication. So maybe you want to show the logged in user's avatar image, right? So you're going to check their cookies for a JSON Web Token or some other information, and you want to display that information on the page. In this case, you're using cookies or headers or some other things. In that case, the page will not be statically rendered because it depends on runtime information in that case, right? So it depends on the incoming request. We need to know that before we can actually render the page, right? I don't know who's going to come to the page when I run a build here. So we cannot pre-render the page for something like that. So it will automatically be opted out of static rendering into dynamic rendering. So that was a problem because for a small element like this, it would turn the whole page into dynamic rendering, even though it's only this little piece, this little island, you could say, that runtime information. So with PPR, so with partial pre-rendering, the idea is that you can wrap it in a suspense, basically mark a boundary between this part that needs that dynamic behavior. The rest of the page, the shell around it, can still be statically rendered, but just this piece in here can stay dynamically rendered. And that was the idea with partial pre-rendering. And I think that's still the behavior, but I think a lot of this caching behavior is going to be unified in what they call cache components. And there's going to be some differences in the implementation, and there will be additional features, right? So for example, this use cache is also part of cache component. So a lot of this caching behavior, I think, is going to be unified in this cache components. And they do mention that more of that will be documented and announced ahead of the table release, right? So as of recording, this is still in beta, but there should be more information about this soon. If you already want to use things like use cache, you do have to opt into the cache components is true option here in Next config. And actually I have increased this to the Canary version actually as well. So the beta itself didn't have this. So I did have to go to the Canary here on Next.js 16. So if you want to try that out, but I wouldn't worry too much about the caching. There's going to be a big update, it seems. And I'll create a great video on this soon when that update is here, so you have a clear picture of how all of that works. So make sure you're subscribed and so you get notified when that video is here. There are also some big changes at the React level actually that can also really improve your apps. So it now supports the React compiler, which is stable. So you can see here on the React blog, version 1 is now available. and we can now also use it in Next.js. So we just have to add React compiler to our config file here. And we do have to install this plugin for Babel. So this relies on Babel, and they do mention that you should expect the compile times in development and during builds to be higher when enabling this option, because this React compiler relies on Babel. Okay, now what do you get for that? Well, what does the React compiler do? Well, most notably, it can automatically optimize your React app with automatic memoization. So in React, you may have used the use memo hook, right? So if you're doing some kind of heavy computation in your component, right? So here, for example, we're doing sorting on an array. Now, if this is a big array or some complex array, we're doing complicated sorting. Whenever this component renders without use memo, we would have to do the sorting over and over again, right? So this is not good for performance. So with use memo, we can just sort once. And then whenever this component re-renders, we can just keep using the same result. Of course, if some of the dependencies here change, we do want to sort again. This will reduce the amount of time that we have to sort, right? Sorting is just one example, but essentially we can avoid a bunch of heavy computations being done over and over again unnecessarily with use memo, right? So that is use memo. Now there is also use callback. So if you're putting a function here just in the body of the component, it would be recreated every time the component renders. That is not efficient, and especially if you're using it as a dependency somewhere, maybe a use effect dependency, it would be viewed as a different function every time. We could wrap it with use callback so that you just get one function. It's not necessarily recreated over and over again. And there is also React.memo. So this, you can wrap your component with this. So by default, React component is re-rendered if its parent re-renders. But if the props of the component don't change, we don't want to render it. So we could wrap it in React.memo, right? So up until this point, we had to manually identify those spots and we had to write it ourselves. The big promise here with React compiler is that it can do that automatically for us. And they actually mention in most cases, this memoization will be as precise or even more so than what you may have written yourself. So this is really powerful, and they recommend for new code, we recommend relying on the compiler for memoization and only using those hooks where you really need precise control. Now, what about your existing code? Can you just remove all of those use memos? They do recommend leaving existing memoization in place. Removing it can change compilation output, or if you're going to remove it, you have to be careful and do a bunch of testing before and after removing. So actually a big update and can really improve the performance of certain React apps, especially ones that are doing a bunch of heavy computation in certain components. All right, and Next.js 16 will also support React 19.2. So 19.2 actually came out earlier this month. It actually has some really interesting updates as well. Now, quick heads up, if you're doing npx create next app and then the beta, it actually installed React 19.1.1 for me. So if you do want to use the latest one, they do mention this command as well. So React at latest and React DOM at latest as well. And then you should get 19.2. Now, why would you want to upgrade to 19.2? Well, one of the things we get now are view transitions. So this allows us to create some really beautiful animations here, almost like you're on like a mobile app. This helps us build experiences that are just as smooth and delightful actually as what you see on a lot of mobile apps. And so traditionally, these types of animations are a bit tricky to do on the web. With these transitions, you can more easily create really beautiful experiences here. And the way it works is that you use the view transition component. So here you just wrap this in a view transition, and then when this component is rendered on the page, right? So here, if I click the button, that item component will be rendered. If I click now, you can see it actually has a default animation. You can configure that with props, but by default, it will be like faded in and out like this. But there are a bunch of optional props here that you can use to specify how it should behave. And there is also the new activity component, which also solves an issue that you've probably run into before with React. You can imagine I have something in this sidebar here. If I click on this, the state changes, right? So I have an overview is opened now, right? Now, I'm closing the sidebar. Now it's gone. But if I open it up again, you can see that we lost that state, right? So I now have to click on this button again to open it up, right? So we basically, when we remove the sidebar, we lose the state that was inside that sidebar. And what you can do is you can wrap that sidebar in the activity component. So now when you do that, when I open up this overview here, now when I actually hide the sidebar, its state will be preserved. Now when I open it, it's still there, right? So we can sort of persist that eternal state when it's removed. So, and the way that React is doing this behind the scenes, it's actually doing display none in the CSS. So it's not completely removing this from the DOM. It's just using some CSS to remove it from what we see. That allows it to keep the state. There's also a new hook, use effect event. So when you have a use effect here, and inside this use effect, you use a variable called URL, then you have to add it to the dependency array, right? And that means every time this changes, the function in the use effect here will run again, right? So this is all standard behavior. If I have another variable in there, maybe I'm using number of items. If I would use that in here, then I would have to add it to the dependency array as well. So then whenever the number of items would change, this would rerun. Now, sometimes that's not what you want, right? So if number of items changes here, maybe I don't want it to rerun. So in that case, you can extract that part of the logic out and wrap it here in use effect event. So in this case, I'm logging a visit with some URL and that number of items. In that case, I only use the URL. Right, so the number of items here is outside the use effect. So I don't have to specify it here. A little bit tricky, but basically a way to separate out the reactive parts and things that really should react, and the non-reactive part, things that we do not want to cause some reaction. Now, some other things, actually, the version requirements for Next.js 16, you need a newer Node.js version. So Node.js 18 is no longer supported. This is mostly relevant, I think, if you're self-hosting Next.js. I was actually doing a video on self-hosting it on a VPS, and the VPS with Coolify actually was using an older version by default. And so the Next.js 16 version didn't work. So I actually had to upgrade the Node.js version on that VPS. So check out my other video on that. Now about the Next.js version itself. So right now we are already on Next.js version 16. Now somebody was asking about it, why is there a major version release? And the CEO of Vercel, they did mention that they're being strict. So if you were wondering about that, that is why we're already on version 16. It's not a problem for me, but I can imagine that you may start to feel a bit behind if the latest version is already ahead of you, but it is because they are being strict. Now let me actually show you what I'm doing here with Mocha. So when the user submits a post, we're creating a post in our database, but we're giving it a status of processing because we actually want to get some other data about what the user submitted in the title and content as well. You can imagine we want to get some kind of summary about the blog post and tags for the blog post, so it's easier to search for the post, for example. There's a bunch of work that we want to do on that blog post, but we don't need to do that right now. We don't have to interrupt the user's experience. We can just quickly give a response to the user and then run those tasks in the background. Now, if you've ever tried to do something that yourself, you know it's a bit tricky to do that in Next.js. Next.js is really built around a very fast request response cycle. It's not really built for long-running tasks like a background or queuing system or cron jobs. So actually what I'm doing here, I'm passing it off here. I'm sending it to my Mocha instance. Mocha is sponsoring the channel. I had a great time using them actually. They're part of Vercel's open source program. So you can find them here on GitHub as well. So that's where I'm sending my post to. So actually it's really nice that I can have my, you could say, front-end-ish Next.js app right here. And then for all the background jobs, I'm using Mocha in this case. Mocha is just an app by itself, an API call, and we can just send an API call to Mocha. It has made it super easy to build out a workflow like this. And so here's my Mocha app. Here's my Next.js app, and let me show you how it works. I'm going to run them both, right? So very common to have like a front-end and back-end application in one workspace. So I'm going to run my Next.js application on this side, and then I have the Mocha app on this side. Now, what do I get with this when I now submit a post? So now if I submit a post, I'm going to publish this post here. You can see I'm getting this response here on the UI very fast, but now in the background, my Mocha workflow is working on enriching it, localizing it, embedding it, creating embeddings for search. And then when it's finished, it's finalized, my Next.js application here, an update here, everything went all right. And so my Next.js application is receiving the updated post here with the title and content still, but then it now also has a summary, okay? It has tags, it has translations, and I can get all of that without cluttering up my Next.js application, right? So I'm able to separate that background workflow from my Next.js application. So here in Mocha, the way that works is with steps. So in React, everything is a component. In Mocha, everything is a step. And it makes it very easy to build out this workflow. So for example, it starts off with an API step. So we can actually trigger the workflow. We can make an HTTP request and get it started. So here it just gets an incoming request. So here I can specify the type of the step, what's an API, and it's just meant as a way to kickstart the workflow. We can specify a path, right? So then here in my Next.js application, I need to send an HTTP, I need to send a request to /post, right? Because that's what I specify here. It needs to be a post request. And I can also specify the incoming data. What kind of shape does it have to be? It's using Zod for that actually. So here I have my Zod schema, right? So it will receive that incoming post. It emits an event. There are other steps that will subscribe to that. So when this event occurs, they will start running. So there is a post created event, and this other step subscribes to that. So here I'm doing some SEO enrichment on the post, and it runs when the event post created occurs. Here I have the logic. So I'm getting that post data and I'm sending that off to OpenAI. We're asking OpenAI, hey, can you enrich this post with some additional data? Right? This can take multiple seconds. In fact, if you're using the latest models with AI, sometimes it may actually take multiple minutes. Right? That would be kind of awkward to force into the Next.js app. But here I can just do that in the background. Eventually it's finished and I'm going to emit an event again, that the post is now enriched. So then I have another step that has subscribed to that event. So this is a localized step, so it may do some translations, for example, but it also wants to translate the SEO data. So it needs to wait until that event has occurred. So here we could send it off to an AI. I'm just sleeping for 4 seconds here to simulate how long that would approximately take. But it's just going to add some data to the post and emit an event. So after localization, we can index this post for search. Maybe create embeddings, store it in a vector store. And this will emit an event. And then ultimately that is finished and I have one finalize step. And what this will do, it will just make an API call back to my Next.js application again with the additional data that it has been able to generate in here in this workflow. So now here in the UI, if I submit a post, I get a very fast response here, but I can still see, just to show that it is processing. In the background now, Mosha is enriching it, localizing it, adding search embeddings. Could be multiple minutes. It's Mosha calling back into the Next.js app. So my Next.js app can expose an API route handler, my Next.js 6 route handler API/Mosha. It will receive that webhook from Mosha and we can just update in our database, right? Status of completed in this case. And remember, those posts are cached. Then when Mosha is finished, which could take multiple minutes, we do need to update the cache again. So now, like I showed you, we have the new update tag, but this can actually only be used in server actions, right? So here in a route handler, where you often do need to invalidate cache because you're getting some webhook from, well, Mosha in this case, or some kind of CMS. So you do need to be able to invalidate the cache. So in that case, you kind of have to use revalidate tag or revalidate path. But revalidate tag is a little bit more fine-grained, right? So this is a more realistic setup because in a more sophisticated application, you often want to do a bunch of work in the background, right? You can imagine if we want to do something on a schedule, like a cron job, this would also be a bit awkward to fit into a Next.js app. But with Mosha, that would just be one step. And you also get really great observability here. So here you have the workbench and we'll show you how long these steps took, right? So I'm stringing together these steps. And then when you have an actual run of that, you get observability here. So I can see localize here took quite a long time. So I can click on it and I get some details here. I can see how long it took and what kind of event it's emitting. Now, if this step would fail, with Mosha, we can actually automatically retry the step as well. So you get a bunch of robustness as well. Now, if you want to try out Mosha, you can just run this command here, which you can find on their homepage, and you will get a basic setup here so you can inspect and get a feel for how it works. You also get a really nice visualization here in the workbench, by the way. So here in that default setup, I can see an overview of my workflow here. These are all the steps, right? So if I'm wondering, hey, what's going on in this step again? What's the code here again? I can inspect that right here. I'm zoomed in a bit, and here I'm using TypeScript, but if you have somebody on your team who's more familiar with Python, you can actually also use Python. You can have some steps in TypeScript, some steps in Python. I'll have more videos with Mosha coming up, but I recommend that you check them out. You can find a link in the description. In any case, I hope this helps you out with the latest Next.js. There's a lot to it, but if you keep up to date, it's not that bad. And I'll create another video soon on the whole caching system in Next.js, so stay tuned, make sure you're subscribed. In any case, hope this helps you out, and thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.